All right, welcome to another Fitter Body, Stronger Mind live discussion. We're talking today about strategies for optimizing your training program, how you can use the tricks of the top athletes out there to maximize your own training at home, and various questions regarding periodization, which stimulus to provide for certain goals, which stimulus can be combined and produce the desired effect. And all these kind of questions we'll hopefully try and get around a little bit during this one. This has come up because this has been something we've actually been talking about a little bit and researching for ourselves, Gaz, isn't it?
It is, yes. Well, on the grounds of concurrent training. So if no one knows what concurrent training means, strength and endurance at the same time, because there's a lot of talk about this, of how one training mode impacts the other. So for example, if I'm lifting heavy weights and trying to gain muscle, will that affect my endurance, and vice versa? And the answer to it is, in a nutshell, let's just call it cardio for want of a better expression, your endurance training will not be impacted and may in fact be enhanced by your strength training. The strength training will be inhibited, not as much as the paranoid die-hard bodybuilders believe, but it will not be completely optimized if you're undergoing endurance training at the same time. And there are lots of things you can do to continue your endurance training to mitigate those effects. It doesn't mean you will not gain strength. You will if you're strength training. It just won't be as fast as if you weren't doing endurance activities. And there's lots and lots of theories behind the mechanisms on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's probably one of the most obvious sort of misnomers that comes up in training is, to what extent one stimulus what's the word I'm looking for? Compromises another stimulus in terms of its adaptation effect. Really common question that we get from people trying to build lean mass is, should I stay away from cardio? Should I stop all cardio in order to maximize my hypertrophy gains? And if the answer is probably, if the only sole goal at that time is to maximize hypertrophy, then probably not necessarily essential to do any more than very, very small amount of cardio. But for somebody who's looking to improve both, there's definitely opportunities to train both there. And as you say, you're not going to maximize the results of either if you're not sending a clear signal. But there are ways of going about doing it in a way that's kind of going to make it, that's going to yield the best results for you possible, aren't there? For example, training each stimulus at separate times rather than combine them into one session, so that the body's only having to deal with one sort of signal at a time. You're a great person to talk about this because your background is professional mixed martial arts, which literally requires you to be proficient in every single component of fitness, doesn't it? There's nothing that's out of the picture there. You've got strength, power, agility, flexibility, speed, and endurance all rolled into one. So, what are your strategies back in the day? Because let's face it, as we just were talking about then, the science hasn't really changed from what I've seen for the last couple of decades on this.
No.
It's still pretty conclusive in one regard or another. So what strategies did you use to divide up your training when you were competing at such a high level in mixed martial arts back then?
For me, there's an expression where you say strength first. So with strength, you basically prehab against any potential injuries. That said, the caveat to strength first is cardio is king in mixed martial arts. Your ability to be good only lasts as long as your endurance. What's that classic expression from old Farmer Burns, the classic old school wrestling trainer from the 1880s in the Midwest in the States? And his was, fatigue makes cowards of us all. So what it means is it doesn't matter how great you are, how brave, how gung-ho, how strong you are. as soon as you start to fatigue, you will, you know, your balls retract. You know, you will start to slow down. I definitely remember in some of my earlier fights, before I realized how important conditioning was, I almost felt like I would rather get beaten up than feel the pain of putting out effort, you know, to continue to win. Like it hurts when you're suffering, when you're blowing out your butt and your arms hurt and it just hurts to get up. Almost chemically, your body is telling yourself, if you keep moving, I might, you know, overheat, exhaust myself and die. And in many ways, I felt more afraid of being fatigued than I was taking a punch. Like, that's how horrible it can feel to crash out, even in a fight. So on concurrent training, for me, if you have there's two people now. We've got either a novice trainer or someone that's taken a lot of time off, or an experienced person. For me personally, I feel if I ever take time out of training, and then maybe even if my goal is strength, or even not just strength, I want to put on a bit of size, against popular thinking, I actually start with some what you would call cardio training first. Because I find when I'm out of shape and I just go and hit the gym, I lack intensity that I would have that if I was in shape, cardio-wise, cardiorespiratory-wise. Because I find that, you know, your blood pressure goes up, you start pumping iron, you get a bit of a headache, you feel a bit sick, you know, just your capillarization, your ability to handle it, your heart and everything isn't quite up where it could be. So if I take just a couple of weeks to get back in the swing of, you know, a little bit of steady state running, a few sprints, things like that, I then come back and hit the gym, and the intensity and the quality of my sessions are so much better that my gains are so much better as well. So that's me. That's case study one. Case study two, if you're a novice trainer and you want to get in all-round great shape and you want that general adaptation first, I would advise a period of strength training. This is over a matter of weeks and months, to start first, just to strap up all those muscles. As you like to say, Cameron, people forget that one of the primary functions of a muscle isn't just the big movements, isn't just push, pull, etc., and to resistance. It's also to stabilize a joint. So strength first if you're a novice trainer. If you've somehow managed to reach adulthood and you haven't truly trained or been that physical before, I would recommend strength training first and then start your endurance training to get in shape. And what that will do is, again, it'll prevent injury. Then there's the next case. Okay, so you've been training for a while. You're generally adapted to physical activity. And now your goal is you want to increase muscle size and or strength, but you don't want to lose endurance, or maybe you want to keep gaining your endurance abilities. How do we time that? So fundamentally, the research hasn't changed since the 1980s. It's all concurrent. That is, you want at least a 6 to 8 hour gap between those training sessions. And what really impacts your training would be the kind of body part used in endurance and the kind of body part that's being trained. So say, for example, I went running in the morning. Before I did my squats in the evening, I would ideally have a 6 to 8 hour gap between those. With concurrent training, your aerobic capacity isn't actually impacted by your strength training. If anything, it's in results-wise, not the aerobic system itself, but your performance generally gets enhanced when you endurance train and strength train, probably for local muscular reasons, probably again for the fact that your joints are a bit more stable, etc., etc. So people's performances tend to improve when they're an endurance athlete who does strength training. When you're a strength athlete that starts doing true endurance training, your rate of gains won't be as fast, but it doesn't mean to say you will not gain. And that is only truly relevant. The only people that probably notice that are things like, elite level powerlifters and weightlifters. For the rest of us, you probably won't even notice, because you'll be happy making gains anyway. And the degree by which it impacts your strength gains is much less than, say, the average sort of recreational pump iron guy that hears this information would be inclined to think. All these sort of body dysmorphia type things. Oh, it's the cardio I'm doing, I'm not growing fast enough. It probably has an almost negligible effect on anybody that isn't an elite or professional strength athlete. So that said, how do you time it? So again, if you're going to do 2 sessions in one day, ideally you would do your strength training first and then do your endurance training afterwards. Or if you have to do it the other way around, you want a 6 to 8 hour gap in between. Why would you do strength first and endurance later? Because essentially your endurance training, even though you feel fully recovered, can impact the intensity of your max strength training. So if you're imagine if you're a little bit fatigued, you're not going to lift your heaviest weights, because you can't deplete yourself and be a little bit tired and then go put out maximal efforts. But you can do maximal efforts and then go for a long run, an easy run to build endurance, which is essentially somewhere between 50 and 70% of your max effort. Does that make sense? So if
Absolutely,
I do 100% effort on my squats in the morning, wait 8 hours, and then running comparative to that, because of the distance I'm running, is only, 50 to 70% of that intensity, then I'll be able to get that out. So I will have impacted the quality of my training session less.
Yeah, I would go as far as to say that it would almost be, you can't say pointless, but I would say it would be an absolute last resort to train a strength session after a endurance-based session within the same day, because the glycogen loading process that would come after that endurance-based training would just be insufficient to fuel you adequately through an intense training. And if it was going to be me, I would definitely look at programming in the endurance parts of your week, either before, prior to other cardio-based training, or prior to your recovery and active recovery periods, and getting the strength training done at the periods of the week where you're fresh. Because even, as you say, even the day after a long run, you will still be fatigued from long, steady endurance. Absolutely, for sure. Unless, in any case, if we're talking about concurrent training from the perspective of somebody who is not only strength training, but is strength training for body composition, so for hypertrophy, which is a hugely expensive process to the body anyway. You're going to have to be plugging some serious fuel into the machine if you're if you're going to get any hypertrophic outcome off the back of that by including endurance and strength training within a fairly kind of close window. So, and this is what we're going to talk about, a little bit today, how to divide up the days. You've touched on it, which was a brilliant point, 6 to 8 hours between workouts at an absolute minimum. But if we're doing heavy strength work, doing intense strength training, that's got to come before endurance, because, one's always going to compromise the other. And so, a large part of it is, what's your primary goal? And then the training conducive to that is your training, that's your core training. And then the training conducive to whatever your other goals are is essentially your supplementary training, isn't it? So, if endurance happens to be your primary goal at the time, and you still want to get intense strength work in, then maybe you're okay to compromise your strength workouts by focusing on the endurance aspects of it, but so it does all come down to an individual matter. But if we're assuming that you're trying to get the best out of both outcomes, then dividing it up with at least a day or two in between an endurance session. If you're doing endurance, leaving it a day or two in between that and your next heavy, intense strength session is probably going to be optimal. Would you agree?
Yes, definitely. And I think we've touched on what I consider sort of true endurance, like systemic endurance, regarding, cardiopulmonary, heart and lungs, getting oxygen-rich blood to everywhere in the body, bit of capillarization with that. And then there's a second type of endurance, which is local muscular endurance. And that local muscular endurance, believe it or not, sort of bodybuilders and stuff are sort of quite good at that. So that 8 to 12 rep range, when you want a muscle to grow, we've talked about this in lots of our previous talks. There's two ways of building strength. So number one is the skill of strength. How well and coordinated are you firing an individual muscle and across a group of muscles? That's what strength is. Strength in many ways is a skill. But strength is also related to the cross-sectional density, the size of muscle fibers as well. So there's two ways of building it. And if you want to maximize strength, and this is something I did, where after I left the gym, left London Shoot Fighters, I just got bored and I just started pumping iron, and I had a lot of time. And I sort of did a concurrent max strength and hypertrophy at the same time. And even this you can essentially do in the same session. And it ends up being quite voluminous, but it definitely does work. I got some of my best strength gains of my life doing this. And what I did is I would pick a primary movement and do 5 fives. So something just heavy enough that I can basically get out 5 fives of them. So let's just call it squat. So I would do 5 fives of back squat. That was my primary movement, and the one I gauged my strength by as my strength increased. What it increased on my 5 by 5s on my back squat. Then I would strip the bar down and complete either 3 sets of 10 or 4 sets of 8 on that same movement. And then I picked 2 other movements, and they could typically it would be front squat and lumberjack squats or something like this, or it could be front squat and a leg press machine or whatever. I'm a fan of barbells, so I tended to stick to those. Again, same format, 4 sets of 8, 3 sets of 10, just about fatiguing muscle fibers. So the first 5 fives was about strength. How strong am I this week? And then the rest of it was just about getting a pump and fatiguing the muscle fibers. Sometimes I may not even get through my 4 sets of 8. Sometimes my weight on that would be more than the last week. Sometimes it would be less than the last week because I'd gone up on my 5 by 5s. So that was not the weight that I was judging my strength by. What I was judging my strength increases by was whatever I could do my 5 by 5s with on that core exercise, which for me, I decided for the legs was the back squat. Just to drum that point home, let's call it bench press. You're going to do flat bench 5 fives. You're going to strip the bar. You're going to do either 3 sets of 10 or 4 sets of 8, and these are your hypertrophy sets. And then pick another 2 exercises. It could be now dumbbell incline press and dumbbell decline press. So I do 1 movement for pure strength, 3 movements for hypertrophy. And again, it's just about getting a pump. And then you can do the same thing on your back day. On back, I would essentially, my strength move was my deadlift. And then, my reps for getting a pump was the rows and pull-ups and all the rest of it, and lat pull-downs. And this, I personally, for me, I got fantastic strength and size gains. Probably the best, most rapid gains I've ever made in my life. So sort of coming back to it, in terms of muscular endurance there, you can train max strength and muscular endurance in the same session and without compromising one or the other.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. That's awesome. You touched on some really key points there. Just to kind of recap, right at the start, you're talking about how strength training essentially just makes you a much more robust athlete. And this is the reasons why, pretty much every single athlete in every single sport now does some kind of strength and conditioning stuff, because the data is absolutely conclusive that the addition of strength and conditioning of some kind, the rate of injury of overuse dramatically goes down up to, I think it's up to 50% decrease in some studies. So that's definitely an essential component. But really, regardless of what your goals are, you should have some kind of strength and conditioning in there.
Yeah.
And it might be as basic as exploring full range of movement with a fairly light weight, just in order to work on, as you mentioned earlier, I love to bang on about it, just the role of the muscle stabilizing the joint, opening increasing mobility at the joint to avoid injury by stressing it via that means, and then dividing the stimulus up, leaving at least around about a third of a day between sessions, thinking a bit intelligently about which ones to train first, making sure that your priority goal is the one that you're doing on your most fresh days, and then your supplementary goals are the ones that you would train around that. And then everything you just said there was a really great point.
You have hit on a really great point in that when it comes to hypertrophy, that's probably the most metabolically costly change you can make to your body. So just to make that clear for people, when you do aerobic training, you end up not having to eat as much, etc., not simply because you're not trying to get big, but actually most of the equipment that does the job is already there. It's already built. So your veins are already there, your lungs are already there, your heart's already there. Yes, it can get thicker and stronger, but you're not actually developing that many new tissues. You're sort of you're stressing them and optimizing them and making them work more efficiently. When you gain muscle, you're actually building new you. You're actually building more parts of you, and it takes a lot of energy to do that. So in terms of recovery and food, you start want to think about more about your rest and recovery. It's really important if you actually want to gain muscle size. In terms of where you're at, mostly when someone wants to gain muscle size, it's mostly a sort of psychosocial thing. It's for the aesthetic. It's for them, though it is related to strength. If your goals are strength, focus on the skill of strength first. Eventually, you will hit a plateau. So let's think about it like this. You basically want to have the protocol of the power lifter. You want to think about the skill of strength to gain true strength. When you start hitting a plateau, because you've maxed out what the muscle can do, now it's time to take on something of the protocol of the bodybuilder and actually increase muscle size. Because most of your strength gains are neurological, and it's only when you've maxed that process out that you only really need to start developing, more muscle. So most of it is, again, how coordinated you fire your muscles and how strong your tendons are and how strong your nervous system thinks your tendons are, because there'll be certain shutdown systems in place where if you go to lift something that your nervous system deems as massively heavy, most typically there's a thing called the Golgi tendon organ, and this little organelle that sits on your tendons, and it can register tension and pressure. It's a proprioceptor, and when it feels that pressure and that tension is too much for the strength of your tendon, you will stop. You'll shut down. You'll shut down lifting. So everybody's probably felt this when you go to lift something truly heavy, really, really heavy, and you go, nah, it's almost involuntary. You just can't do it. No, can't do it. Whereas if you're lifting for endurance, say like you're just trying to grow your muscle, like your bicep bigger, and you go, eventually it slows down and then stops. So that's just pure fatigue. That's waste products building up in the muscle, interfering with the contractile process, as opposed to it's so heavy, the Golgi tendon organ goes, no, don't do it. You're gonna, pull your tendon off the bone. This is a process that you max out by basically lifting very, very heavy weights over a period of time. And then you kind of, this is where we get into like Russian style step loading, where you'll suddenly increase the weight by about 20% once the lifts that you're doing feel very, very, very easy.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I definitely want to go into that a little bit more, because there's multiple reasons why somebody would plateau, and there's multiple ways of getting around it, isn't there? So, as you say, what we quite often find when people start asking the question of how can I optimize my training, it's because a lot of the time they've started off, they've got quite good results initially because it's a new program, or it's a new stimulus for them. Maybe they've been training for a while, but they've mixed things up or whatever it might be, and then they've got to that point where they're not really seeing the results they want anymore. They're not seeing any results at all, and then they start asking the questions, how can I optimize what I'm doing? So you mentioning plateauing there is like a great point, talking about progressive overload, how to make sure that we are employing the progressive overload principle. But it's important to understand that when you plateau, it's not necessarily the end of the world. It doesn't even necessarily mean that you have to change anything necessarily, because what's happening there, as well as for the reasons that you're talking about there, is that you've gotten used to the stress that's being provided. And it might be that the stress is actually too much at that time for you to keep progressing. You might have just reached the limit of your adaptive energy for that period, but that at some point your body will habituate that constant stress, and your adaptive energy capacity will also increase. Ross Edgley actually talks about this in his book. Ross Edgley is the guy that swam all the way around Great Britain, for anyone who doesn't know, and he's talking about I think he's talking about the fatigue that he's starting to get as he's however many days into that swim. Ended up taking him just under a year, I think. And he's talking about this habituation of stress, how eventually he started to become much more efficient in the water and much more economic after this period of really struggling with it, because his body was starting to habituate the stress, and then his capacity for adaptation began to increase. So he was actually able to keep progressing even though the stimulus was still the same. He was swimming 12 hours a day. His recovery couldn't change. He was coming out of the water. He was on a boat. He was eating as much as he possibly could on the boat, being fed by the woman that's cooking for him. But he just kind of needed that period to habituate the stress, to kind of absorb that stress and tolerate it. And once it became tolerable, then he could start improving again. So it's almost so there's that side of it. And then there's kind of the most obvious solution to plateauing, which doesn't sound particularly scientific, is basically work harder, eat more. Because that is essentially what you're going to have to do. You've got to give yourself a period of time to habituate the stress that you're applying. If that's the reason, reach that limit of adaptive energy. And then from that point, just going to have to figure out a way to work hard to increase your capacity for workload. And that's what we can start talking about now. You mentioned step loading there. There's different ways to apply this overload principle, isn't there?
There are. This is something that I'm about to... So I'm talking purely theoretically now, not from experience. I've always done things, even though I read about this in university, Satsuyowski's books and things like that. I always did my strength training in much the sort of classic Western way, and that is when I just sort of feel like I can lift more, or try to each week add, I'd add 2.5 kilos to each lift, each week essentially, sometimes each session. That worked for me. Step loading apparently is sort of a more lifelong system. So how do both of them work? One is, you do one session, or you go for 1 week, the next week you go a bit heavier. so on and so forth. What step loading does is it gives your body and your nervous system and your tendons and your joints a bit more time to adapt to the stimuli. So essentially what that is say you've been lifting, you've set a weight and you're going to lift it for about 3 months. So even when you feel like you could go up muscularly, you're going to be disciplined and you're going to say no. And then after about 3 months or so, you're going to take a massive leap and you're going to go up by about 20%. So it's going to be a real shock to the system. And what this does is it retrains your nervous system. It lets your nervous system not get complacent, and you have to essentially readapt and become more efficient and or grow more muscle to adapt. By taking so long and letting yourself plateau for so long, what you're doing is you're allowing the tendons and the connective tissues to strengthen and adapt to everything as well, because the muscles will grow faster than that thick fibrous tissue. And that is, in a nutshell, essentially what step loading is. So they're both means of progressive overload, but one is a longer and, at the time of change, more intense process, whereas one is a more gradual process that requires continuous intensity. So, I don't actually can truly say which method is superior. They both definitely work wonderfully for strength gains, but it is something I'm interested in and I'm about to start trying.
Yeah, that's interesting. We'll see. We are our own experiments, aren't we, in this game?
Yeah.
It makes it so exciting, so interesting, because obviously we've got a whole bunch of experience to sort of look back on, but this testament to how it's a continual learning process. I mean, we've both been keeping fit and doing various different sports our whole lives, and we're still reading up on the new research, trying new things, and see, and what happened. There's no victory kind of end result of this. You don't get on the podium and go, I want up fitness. You just always try new things. You're always learning. You're always developing. So it's really.
You're always changing for what's appropriate to your life at the time, and
of course.
There's a point that I was going to make and I left out. There are basically two changes you can make to your training: quantitative or qualitative. Quantitative is in the word; you can quantify it. You either do more or you go heavier. You would basically change the volume or the intensity, or etc. etc. Qualitative, you change the exercise, you change the rest periods, these kinds of things. So I think often people want to go for those qualitative changes and end up not seeing the results they would if they kept with the same exercise but adapted the quantitative means. And that could be by playing with the quantitative means, that's playing with the weight, increasing loading for strength, neurological adaptation, deloading for hypertrophy, and increasing the volume, that kind of thing. And then there are periods where you might just take it easy and even deload just to keep yourself moving and let your body recover for a few weeks, and then bam, ramp up the intensity again. So it's this for me, the quantitative, I feel, should be played with much more than the qualitative. The qualitative really is just to stop you getting bored.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think you're right, and it is something that you can utilize really well, especially in those weeks where, like you say, talking about deload week, deload weeks. Some people do them very regimentally, like every 6 weeks or whatever. I've always found that doesn't really work. That you kind of need to listen to your body at the time, because there's no sense taking a deload week on a week where you happen to be firing really well and everything feels great, and then you're kind of deloading, thinking, I'm working on the neuromuscular sort of side of things, or and all that good stuff, but the weeks where you can lift big, you want to maximize it. If that's your end goal, you want to go for it. Your deload weeks should come on those weeks where you're hitting the gym. Maybe you've had 2 sessions and you are not feeling it, and you realize, right, this is probably the week where I can bring myself back. So I'm much more of an as and when deloader, shall we say? But I do think it's critical.
There's a lot to be said about that, but it also requires you knowing your body very well to do it in that ad hoc way. I think most novices and most beginners do actually need a program to begin with, even if it's not necessarily optimal, so that they can learn their body. They can push through, and then they can kind of know when they're getting truly fatigued or when it's just boredom, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's a big part of the whole, fitness process is getting to know your body, and it takes years.
Yeah, absolutely, it does. Yeah, and you're always tuning into it, and like you say, your body's changing all the time as well. Your physiology's changing, so you're trying to keep up with your physiology. It's kind of like tuning a car while it's on the. People won't remember what it's like to tune a car stereo, but I guess they still have them in cars, don't they? But it's like trying to tune the car stereo when you're still driving around. The signal's always changing slightly, so you're always refining it. What was I going to say? Yeah, there's definitely multiple ways you can apply that overload principle theory. That's a really good example you used, actually, talking about sort of bringing the weight back down. Just to give an example to make it sort of relatable for people. When I was really getting into lifting when I was young, I remember downloading. I'd been doing something like 5x5 for ages. I think I've been switching between like 5x10 and 5x5, kind of trying to get an all-round hypertrophy versus strength training outcome. And I'd gotten to a point where my bench press was still really young, was only about 18, but my bench press was always around about 100 kilos for like 5 reps, and I just couldn't get it over the 100 mark. And I ended up downloading a program, I think it was from somewhere like Westside Barbell or something like that, like one of the quite well-renowned sort of powerlifting, strength training type outlets, gyms. And it was asking me to go right back down to like 55% of my 1 rep max on week 1. And it was only increasing by 5% each week. And I was thinking, oh my God, I'm still going to be only at like working at 80% of my 1 rep max for like in 6 weeks time or whatever. And I was young, and I was like, I want to break through the 100 barrier now, I want to be doing it in 3 weeks. But I decided to give it a go and be patient. And sure enough, when it came to the appropriate week, my bench went straight up through 100K. My deadlift went absolutely through the roof at the time. And it is about giving it some time. And sometimes you just have to have that patience, don't we? Especially when it comes to strength training, asking the body to do a lot in a short space of time sometimes. Awesome, good stuff. We covered loads, but I think we can probably get around periodization before we finish up today. It's a technical, and it's more to do with kind of training for events. But even if we're not training events, is there a big use, in your opinion, for periodization? And how could the everyday person use it?
I think there is. I think in very simple terms, if you have a specific goal, say for example you're committed to fitness, you're going to train all the time, for years now throughout your life as part of your lifestyle. Yes, you can definitely periodize. You can definitely spend times where you dedicate your training time to developing one particular facet over another. You can have a max strength phase, you can have a hypertrophy phase, and you can have an endurance phase. And then at the end of those, you can basically have a conversion phase or a consolidation phase where you bring it all together. So big words, what does that mean, that consolidation and conversion in real terms? Well, put very, very, very simply, let's say you want great muscular endurance and great cardio and great strength. So your muscular endurance is very, very much linked to your absolute strength. What does that mean? That means, why is something called a 1 rep max? It's called a 1 rep max because it's the most you can do at 1 repetition. And then there's these charts. Well, if you can do X for 1 repetition, you should be able to do, you know, X percentage of that for 20 repetitions. So the higher your 1 rep max is, the more your capacity to lift a lighter weight multiple times. Does that make sense? So if you're really, really strong, and I can lift, you know, 100 kilos once, then I should be able to lift 50 kilos, you know, at least, you know, 25, 30 times. But that comes down if you can only, on your max strength lift 80 kilos. You can also improve your anaerobic endurance, your local muscular endurance. So you can bring that number up as well. So there's a time for that kind of training, for that high rep training, but it comes after your max strength training. Because if you really develop your max strength, then your capacity for anaerobic endurance is going to go up. The number of times you can do something locally is going to go up if it's smaller relative to your max strength. I'm hoping that's quite clear. So when you are looking for overall all-round fitness, if you take periods where you dedicate it to cardiovascular endurance, you take periods where you then just maintain that cardiovascular endurance, but you dedicate your strength to maximal strength. When you come to do, let's just call them those metcon, metabolic conditioning type workouts, those circuits at the end of those 2 periods, you're then going to see what your gains are. You're actually going to, you're going to really see the sum of those 2 things. So again, your every kind of endurance is related to your systemic cardio endurance. So the higher your cardio endurance is, the higher your anaerobic threshold is. The higher your max strength is, the more reps you can do anyway. So this is something that a person can do through periods of their life and then bring it over to just being generally fit. So you can spend periods of time working on max strength. You can spend a period of weeks working on aerobic endurance, and then you can go do a whole bunch of circuits and consolidate and reap the rewards of those 2 gains. Why do you do it in that order? Well, we're going to do sort of strength first. I would do it like this. Strength, cardio endurance, max strength hypertrophy, and then do your your metcon, your circuits at the end of it. That would be the order in which I would do it. Max strength to get as sort of prep for your endurance work that's going to stabilize your joints and everything like that. The cardio endurance work to basically raise your potential for your endurance and anaerobic threshold. Back to max strength, where you actually really work on gaining strength and not just treating it as prehab now. That would be a shorter period this time. Then your hypertrophy period to grow some muscles and develop some local anaerobic endurance. And during these times, you're not knocking cardio on the head. You're still doing it, but it's more of a maintenance from the gains that you have made. And then, bam, you're going to hit your hard metabolic conditioning where you're doing, hard circuits, hard sprints, hill sprints, that kind of stuff. And putting those 2 elements together.
So just to make sure that everybody's on the same page with us in terms of like what periodization is, we're talking about breaking down your overarching training program into training blocks, aren't we? So, for a typical athlete, they usually have a season. So we'll be looking at, either including or not including an off season. It would be 8 to 12 months of, maybe 2 to 3 month blocks of where each training block has a slightly different primary objective, right? So we're talking about how to break down the training there. are you talking about training blocks, or are you talking about?
So let's break it down. I'm talking about what I would call mesocycles. So
right, okay.
Let's call it micro, small, meso, we'll go medium, and then macro. So the macro might be the entire year, where you want to be at the end of the year. Your mesocycles are where you're going to focus your training for a period of weeks or months, and then a microcycle. Training session. Oh, you lost me.
Yeah, I just lost you. You went micro, and then.
Okay. All right. So, did I do meso and macro? So.
Yeah, I've lost your visual, but.
Oh no.
Let's go for it.
Let's try and bring that back.
I was thinking you were explaining anyway. That's, but I just wanted the audience to be on the same page so that they knew, because it could have been potentially construed as sort of days of the week or something like that. But we're talking about prioritizing those different things in a certain order throughout the year to make sure that each goal that you have throughout the course of the year isn't compromising your other goals too much at any one time, and you're able to sort of focus on different outcomes through the year to get the most.
Exactly. I'm going to have to log off and log back in 1 second just to get that.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, that's all right. Okay, there's something else I wanted to mention anyway, which I think is really key. So we've got a lot of crossover athletes nowadays, because we've recognized that, training for two different outcomes at the same time is still conducive to a positive outcome for both if we do it intelligently. We've now got this new kind of breed of crossover athletes where people do CrossFit as well as endurance running, as well as weightlifting, or something along those lines. So because we recognize that we can train for two different outcomes at the same time, we do it intelligently, and so we can have this breed of crossover athletes. This is kind of where a lot of the confusion comes from with how to sort of optimize each week. But the good news for people that are crossing over into a more endurance-based sport or a more cardiovascular-based sport from a strength or a bodybuilder-based sport, aesthetics-based sport, is that you might be surprised at how little mass you need to lose in order to become quite significantly more efficient in that sport. And I give a classic example is guys that enjoy sort of bodybuilding but decide that they want to do a triathlon or a marathon. The marathon might seem like a really long distance to a lot of people. On the grand scale of kind of running events, it's fairly mid-range. You have massive long ultras now, multi-stage ultra runs that go for hundreds of miles, and lots of sort of single stage events which are kind of 100 miles or less typically. So a marathon's still quite sort of a mid-range distance, and you can carry a lot of mass and still be quite efficient in a marathon. And you can even argue that because mass is also a glycogen store, so it stores energy for you, it can even be utilized to some benefit. Obviously, it doesn't play in your favor to be more heavy than you need to be. So you're not going to be the best guy on the day if you're carrying lots of additional weight. But that doesn't mean to say that you need to ditch all your muscle just in order to be good. You can still expect to turn up to a marathon or under distance event and do reasonably well and still be carrying like a reasonable amount of mass if you have been sort of bodybuilding and strength training up until that point. And what's more is, as we mentioned earlier at the very early stages of the talk, that strength training that you've been doing up until that point is definitely going to have huge benefits for you in terms of increasing your robustness, your injury prevention. And you're also probably not going to even lose that as much of it as you might think by whittling your strength training down quite considerably. There's been some really interesting studies that I've come across in the last 6 months or so, whereby resistance trained men who went from a 3-day-a-week training split to a 1 day a week training split, one session a week training program, were still able to retain almost all of their muscle mass with relatively low amounts of resistance as well. And even older men up to the age of 70 were still able to maintain a lot of mass. And for anyone who doesn't understand why that's significant, you become much more catabolic. So you start burning, you start atrophying a lot more muscle the older that you get. So for a 70-year-old guy to still be able to maintain muscle from a 3-day-a-week program during a 1-day-a-week resistance training program is quite an exciting discovery, I think. So for those people who have been bodybuilding up to that point, who've been not necessarily entering bodybuilding competitions, but who have been in the gym working hard to put on lots of muscle and think, yeah, this has been cool, but I do fancy a new challenge. I fancy doing an obstacle race or a marathon or a triathlon. You know, you can probably whittle your strength training down to 1 to 2 days a week and still keep a large extent of the mass that you've accrued up until that point. Obviously, depending on how long that training cycle becomes. But that's the good news for people that are crossing over from one to the other. Not so much good news for people who are crossing over from sort of marathon running to bodybuilding. You're probably going to have a pretty steep curve. But having said that, you know, you will have capacity for training intensity. You know, you will have that cardiac output that's going to enable you to get through some pretty
definitely.
So yeah, there are benefits there, probably not quite as translatable. But yeah, I just wanted to express that, Gaz, before we got going, that the maintenance requirements for maintaining muscle and maintaining it, fitness component of any kind, actually, are generally much lower than the requirements to actually improve fitness.
Yeah, so your body likes being fit. When you're there, your body likes to be fit and ready. You're a survival machine. You know, you will strip eventually, but you know, it prefers to be ready than not ready.
Yeah. Awesome. Cool. I think we. I tell you what. One more thing before we finish, if you've got time, because one of the key takeaways I hope people have got from this is that if you're training for multiple goals, you're doing concurrent training, that the absolute ideal is to split the stimulus up over different days, or at least different workouts within a day for the most part. You know, even CrossFitters, as you didn't mention the word CrossFit, but you were talking about this essentially in what you were saying 10 minutes ago or so. You know, even CrossFitters will optimize their training by focusing on lifting one day, cardio on another day, and then they'll do very kind of sport specific, you know, WOD training on other days just to train that specific stimulus. But they don't just do, you know, CrossFit WODs all of the time. They divide up their the different stimulus over different days. So hopefully that's kind of one of the key takeaways that people have got. Which is fine if you've got, you know, 5 to 6 days a week to train. But there are many people out there who want to improve all-round fitness. They want to increase muscle strength and size. They also want to get in better shape, you know, cardio-wise, who maybe only have like 3 days a week to train, or even 2. I mean, I would say that 2, you're probably selling yourself a little bit short. The magic number for me is 3 or more if you really want to achieve a good outcome in all-round fitness. Really, like, you need 3 workouts a week to play with, I would say. But for those, let's just pick 3 as a number, because it's kind of in the middle of being quite a small number, but doable to achieve quite significant results. How could somebody divide up a 3-day split to achieve a kind of all-round fitness outcome? Like, how would you program that for somebody, Gaz? I know how I would do it. I'm just curious to see.
Yeah, it's a good question. One,
and it's not a black and white answer for sure.
Yeah.
It definitely.
Well, number one, it depends where their primary goals are focused. And if it was just the average Joe that wants to be generally fit, I would ideally have 4 days, but if it was 3, then if it really is 3, I would probably do strength, endurance, strength in that order.
Right, yeah. I would side with resistance training.
Yeah.
And what I would probably do, I mean, what I've tended to do for the past in people who've actually had that kind of, who've been on that kind of schedule, is usually a fully focused resistance training session, like full body, but primarily, but just strength. Some kind of cardio based session, and then either a metabolic conditioning type session or a strength session with some anaerobic work at the end, because I feel like those are the two that you can get away with putting together, are intense anaerobic work following on from strength, especially if it's strength and power geared. Those are the two, because these HIIT type sessions can be done in such a short space of time, and I'm talking realistically like 12 to 15 minutes at the most if you're bolting it onto a strength training workout. Really fast sprints, even if it's just taxing like the phosphagen system, like 8-second sprints or something like that. But that's how I've kind of divided it up. That's usually what I end up with, something along those lines: strength day, a cardio day, and then a mixed stimulus day, strength and high intensity cardio, or anaerobic cardio at least.
Yeah, I think I would do the same as a second half of the program. The first half of the program, I would, and this is just me personally because of the way my body reacts, the way I move, I would do a total body 5x5, like almost like anybody can look this up, like a sort of strong lifts type session. Yeah. And then the next session would be the endurance session. Then I'd leave it a couple of days, and I would actually do an explosive, either plyometric or like Olympic lift type session. One of my favorite quick routines for that is basically get a barbell and you keep loading the barbell. So I would do whatever weight I need to do snatches and keep racking up the weight a little bit at a time. I would do anything, normally about 3 to 5 sets of snatches, and I'd pop the weight up after each 3 to 5 reps. And when it gets too heavy for me to do snatches, I take a good rest, and I'm talking anywhere between sort of 5 minutes or so, and then I would start doing power cleans or clean and press. Clean press now. Rack the weight up each set until it gets too heavy to do clean and press, and it just becomes power cleans after a 5, maybe even 10-minute rest. Big rest periods. And then when it gets too heavy for power cleans, I start doing deadlifts and then go all the way up to my max deadlift for that day. And that would be like a sort of power and explosion day. And then if you, after those sessions, at the end of that type of session, I would do what you suggested. So I've got my max strength for my 5.5s. I'm increasing doing some cardio respiratory type output on the next session, whether it's running, cycling, whatever. And then I'm doing the explosive stuff. And then after the sort of second period, let's say I was to do, a month of that, the next month I would do as you said, and on the third session, tack on some endurance work at the end of that strength session. And that would be a sort of consolidating the gains before starting again, trying to increase everything again. But that's just for me personally.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah.
I tell you what, I think there's two general categories of people in the world. I think there's people that would listen to what you just described there and think, oh, God, that sounds absolutely brutal. and then there's the other category of people like, I'm going to try that. The next time I'm in the gym, I'm going to try that, because listening to you describe it's actually getting me excited about
I was making the best gains of my life. that power and explosion day was actually my easiest day, because there was no, it wasn't about any kind of endurance. It's like, oh, it's getting heavy, sit down and have a 5 or even 10-minute rest, and then come back to it, and you're doing the next move. Like now you're doing power cleans instead of having to put it over your head.
We've always
big rests.
We've always said that bodybuilding's like the most fun type of training. It's not really that hard. It's only hard for very short periods. You come out of the gym with a huge pump, feeling awesome. You've rested. You've always rested for longer than you've worked when you've been in the gym doing a training session.
Pure strength training is much easier than endurance training of any kind. 100%. I always. Yeah, I mean, when like I said, when I left London to shoot, this is going to sound so cocky and big-headed, but I started lifting. I made massive gains really quickly, and people would say to me like, "Oh, you train really hard. Oh, like, wow, look at your sessions, look what you do." I just think this is like 5% of being a real athlete, like mentally. The effort. All I do is lift up something heavy. It gets heavy, and I just sit down and take a rest. And I let you let your arms or your legs recharge, and then you do it again. It's not like bollocks now. You haven't do tons of burpees and then jump on the bag and then after your burpees,
5 minutes on the Versa climber when you've already done sparring.
Exactly, 5 minutes on the Versa climber, and then somebody's going to try and take you down, and you've got to defend them for like the next 2 minutes and that kind of stuff. It's like, this is just so easy. Like,
savage.
I always feel a bit pumped. They feel a bit pumped now. I'll rest. I'll let them recover.
Exactly.
I'll do it again.
Mate, endurance is for me, this is the reason why I love endurance, to be honest. I call it demon slaying.
It separates the men from
wrestling period. It's where you get up close and personal with the shit that haunts you in the night,
Yeah.
Because it is going to come out
Absolutely.
when you're tired and, you're on like mile 30 and there's still a couple more to go or whatever. That's why I love just getting out the door and, it's just this fully getting out of the comfort zone in endurance training. And it's funny.
Totally.
That's why I like the name Ironman for Ironman competitions, because it's, me included, I always looked up so much, and you as well, obviously, to like guys like Arnie and, the guys that were heroes in the movies and action heroes. They're always these massive, big, ripped, shredded guys. But actually, the guys that do these ridiculous multi-stage offers and stuff and are coming in Ironmans like under 9 hours, they're the toughest guys on the planet.
Mentally, definitely.
Mentally, Obviously, the toughest guys on the planet are the guys in the cage. But, mentally, it's
100%. They really, really are. Yeah, those guys are the survivors. If we all end up Mad Max, they're the guys that are going to be ruling the planet.
Mate, it'll be David Goggins who'll be the last man running around there when everything else has been wiped.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a pretty good place to finish up, unless you got something you want to throw in.
That's good. I think we covered most things.
Cool. Great stuff. Again, we could talk about it for hours. We'll probably do another one, a similar thread. Guys, if you haven't already grabbed your copy of the Fit Body Stronger Mind ebook, it's free. It's got all the essentials for developing awesome fitness and mindset for success. And if you're ready to take the leap to elite health and performance, you can apply for a space on our exclusive coaching program by following the link in the description there. And we'll get back to you to explore whether or not you're the right fit for us and we're the right fit for you. And without further ado, have an amazing day, and we'll catch you guys very soon.
See ya.
For now.